In today's session, I am going to be talking about the type of women that most men find more desirable. And by type, I'm not referring to characteristics or features that are incidental to who you are, such as your ethnicity, the color of your skin, your preferences in terms of your sexual preferences, or anything like that. I'm referring more to a hierarchy of women in relation to desirability. Now, let me get today's session started by maybe starting with a breakdown of the different types that I'll be referring to. Now, let me begin with single women. So the first would be single women. Single women who are sexually active. Number two, we have widows. Widows who have no kids or who have no children. Number three, divorcees, people who are divorced, no kids or children. Number four, people who are divorced, people who are divorced with children or with a child, with kids, or with a child. In this case, let's say one. Now, number five would be the unmarried with kids. And this is what we call single mothers. But if I had to be very honest, these are single mothers. These are single mothers in the technical sense. However, what we generally, or what the marketplace generally calls such women, are baby mamas. Baby mama. And number six, the unmarried. With kids. In this case, number five is with kids, same father. Number six is unmarried with kids, multiple fathers. Again, technically, women will call themselves single mothers. Men call them baby mamas. We call each of these groups, the single mothers, we call this type 1. This we call type 2, and this we call type 3. They're not all the same. And this, what I'm referring to, is a hierarchy of women in relation to their sexual marketplace value. And this is what men find desirable. Men prefer single women who are sexually active. The next will be widows who have no kids. The third would be divorcees who have no kids. And then technically speaking, you should have something here which is for the widows with kids. Let's call this 4, let's call this 5, and let's call this 7. So we have 7 groups. Widows with kids, same father. Now, and let me break this down in just a little bit more detail to explain how this works, well, let's assume we have 7 women. And I think this will make a lot of sense once I explain this, because the purpose of today's session, I should have said, is not necessarily to help women in there who are looking for a husband. It's really to educate the younger women so they understand how a poor decision, poor choices can lead to a devaluation of your true value in the marketplace, and could lead to a life that is a lonely life, and a life where your kids end up being raised without a male role model around, which has severe consequences. We don't need to give them names, but I will. Caitlin, let's call this Jane. Let's call this Maya. Let's call this Anne. Let's call this Hammond. Let's call this Helen. I'm running out of options. Let's call this Yvonne. Okay, 7 women. Let's assume, for the purpose of today's session, that all of these women have a sexual marketplace value of a default position of a 6 based on their looks. They all look equally comparable. Before we bring in their status in relation to parenthood, one of the ones I haven't made reference to in this session would be what I call virgins. But let's be very honest. The concept of finding a woman today who's a virgin, who's above 18, in the West is very, 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 very hard. It's really novel. Virgins are usually the most desirable for marriage. They're the least desirable for casual dating, for obvious reasons. Men who are in the marketplace for sex are not willing to wait. On the other hand, men who are willing to get married immediately are quite happy to get married to someone who's a virgin, and they prefer women who are still virgins. You're not touched. You don't have the complications that most sexually active women have, and therefore your marketplace value is usually the highest for men who want such arrangements. There are men in the marketplace who do not want the responsibility of having to teach a young virgin about sexuality. So to a segment of men, virgins are also undesirable. I haven't put virgins in for that purpose. But keep this in mind, that we're beginning with 7 women who have, from a sexual marketplace value in terms of their looks, size, height, facial qualities, they're quite similar. We start off with a ranking of a 6. What I'd like to show you is how I made reference to the fact that decisions have consequences, and consequences lead to constraints, and such constraints come with you having to make a trade-off. And I'm going to try and tie these things together. If you are single and sexually active, and in this case, let's say all of these women are 27. So each of these women have been sexually active from the age of 18. Now what that means is, in principle, a woman who is, number one, single, sexually active, 27, has had a wealth of experience in having sexual relationships with men, but she's been careful. Therefore, most men who are looking to get married of a certain socioeconomic level would find such women to be easy to work with, because they have not and this is an important statement, they have not given themselves to any man or given their hand in marriage to anyone. Let me deviate and make reference to something very off topic, but I think it would emphasize the value that a woman has. It's not something that is appreciated in the West. A woman, in relation to your sexuality, I made reference to the fact that we are not supposed to have multiple sexual partners before we get married. That is a very modern concept. If you go back to the 19th century, the 18th century, and even the start of the 20th century, most women were virgins and untouched at the point of marriage. As a matter of fact, in the early days, if you go and you study the books of antiquities, you find that when a woman got married, the family of both the families of both the mother, the boy and the girl, and all of your friends would stand outside of the tent on the wedding day. Both the man and the woman would go into the tent, and those who were invited to the wedding would wait outside. In the tent will be some form of straw. This is back in the early days. And the father of the woman would have laid down a white sheet for his son-in-law to have his first sexual encounter with his daughter. In other words, to disvirgin or de-virgin his daughter. Both will go into this, and everyone else will wait outside. When they had finished, both of them had to come out, and the man had to hold up the sheet to the community or to the family. If they looked at the sheets and they did not see blood, because when a woman is de-virgined or lose her virginity, the hymen is broken, and usually you spill blood because that's a covenant. It's a spiritual covenant where you break the hymen, you spill blood. And therefore, the sheet should show and reveal that something has happened for the first time. If the man came out and the sheets did not reveal any blood or indication that the hymen was broken or that it was the first time, the community would stone the woman to death. Now, this goes back to the books of antiquities. I'm not condoning it. I'm simply saying that the whole concept of having multiple sexual partners is a very new concept. It's a modern day concept. We can say confidently that over the last few thousands of years, women have always been expected to give themselves to one person, the person you get married to. Therefore, it is the case that in relation to how men perceive women, because the expectation of a woman remaining pure no longer applies, men tend to expect sex almost immediately in today's modern dating environment. So keep that in mind. But the point I was trying to make was, let me use a story. And it's a biblical story. And for those who are agnostic, I understand. And for those who are perhaps of a different faith, I understand. But I think it's an important story, whether you believe it or not. In several parts of the Bible, whether you're reading the Old Testament or whether you're reading the New Testament, the Old Testament, you could say, applies to the Judaic Gospels, or the New Testament, which applies more to Christians. Although Christians look at the entire Bible, Jews look more towards the Old Testament and specific books in the Old Testament. For those who are not aware, almost 2/3 of the Quran can be found in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the book of the Torah. And what this means is that if you were to read both the Quran, the Judaic Bible, or the Christian Bible, what you find is that at several points in time, there was always an event that took place. An angel appeared to a woman and said, "You will conceive of a child." Whether you're referring to Samson's mother, or whether you're referring to Samuel's mother, or whether you're referring to Elizabeth, who was the mother of John the Baptist, or whether you're referring to Mary, who was the mother of Jesus, there was always an angel that appeared and said, "You're about to have a son, your son will be a special child." But there was an invitation for her to accept that she would use her womb as a vessel, as an incubator for something great. Every child that is born in this world is great, because every child that is born is of the Lord. It's spirit in human flesh. So every child is great. And therefore, whether you're looking at Jesus, John the Baptist, whether you're looking at Samson, or whether you're looking at Samuel, what you find is a request to women to give to the man who was her husband, or to give to the angel the highest honor, which is to use the woman's womb to create new life. And what that means is that when a woman is single, she has not given that honor to any other man. And therefore men value that. When a woman, on the other hand, has already had that experience with another man, it means that she's given her womb and the highest honor, the highest blessing, the highest covenant, she's given there to another man. And therefore men who come afterwards, in many ways, are considered less, because the man who comes first always is the first. And what that means, if we go back to today's session, the consequence of that is that as we go down this list, the value of a woman drops in the marketplace. Her sexual marketplace value drops. So if all of these women start off with a 6 in their looks, aesthetics, height, weight, and physical attributes in terms of beauty, the one who is a single woman, number 1, will maintain her value at 6. The woman who's a widow, because she has no kids, will maintain her value, because we know that we should look after the widows and the orphans. So usually men in the marketplace do not hold against the woman the idea that she is 27, she was married, but her husband died. In many ways, most men see that as evidence that she can work with the man, and that for whatever reason, the universe decided to take her husband away. A woman who is number 3, which is a divorcee with no kids, because you were a divorcee with no kids, you haven't given that honor to anyone. But the fact you're divorced shows 2 things. 1, that you were seen to be attractive enough to be chosen by a man. But it also shows that perhaps you're difficult to work with. Whether the reason for the divorce was yours or his, most men see that as a disadvantage. So the question most men have in mind is, why did you get divorced? And in this country, 70% in the UK, 70% of all the divorce filings are made by women in this country. And therefore most men see that as a concerning situation. Whether the man cheated, whether he robbed, stole, beat you up for whatever reason, they see that as a failure in your judgment, which means you lose half a point. Now, for someone who's number 4, which is a widow with kids, but the same father, you lose 1 point. You go down to 5. For someone who is unmarried with kids, what we call baby mama, type 2. So she has more than one child, but from the same father. Big difference between an unmarried woman with kids and a divorcee with kids. The woman who is considered to be unmarried with kids, same father, you lose 2 points, which means you drop down to a 4. Now I skipped one, which is number 5, which is someone who is divorced with kids, but one child. I skipped that one. That should have been, no, I didn't. Yeah, you lose 1 point because you have one child. But if you're unmarried with kids, your baby mama, type 2, you lose 2 points. If you're unmarried with kids, but you have multiple fathers, meaning you've had more than one man that you've given that honor, you lose 3 points. You drop down to a 3. Now, the question is, why does this matter? And what are the constraints and trade-offs? Let me begin with the trade-offs. One of the trade-offs is men are always looking to get more in value than we pay in cost. We want to ensure we get something at its intrinsic value. And if we can get that at the discount, great. What this means is that a woman who is ranked a 6 would be looking, the best she can expect will be a man who is a 6 in his ability to provide, protect, and all the other things a man does for a family. Provision, protection, promotion, prayer, and keep all of his promises. So she would be looking to get an equivalent, a man of equal ranking or slightly below. But because men generally want a better deal, you would find that the man she would most likely get would be a man who is a 5. A woman who is number 2, a widow, no kids, same thing applies. Most likely she'd get a man who's a 5. This is an average man. A woman who's divorced, no kids, would be expected to get a 5.5, which would mean she's looking at roughly, again, a 5, again, an average man. A woman who is divorced but has kids, who is a 5, will be expected to get less. She would be expected to get an average man, but what you might find is that she gets a man who is between a 4 and a 5. That's what she should expect. Same thing applies to a woman who is divorced with kids, 4.5. A woman who is unmarried with kids will be expecting a man who's a 4 or a man who's a 3 to 4. So he's below average. Below average. And a woman who is unmarried with multiple kids from multiple fathers would expect a man who is a 3 or a man who is a 2, which is way below average. Now what you see here is that there's a disproportion. It's quite disproportionate based on the type of man that they can attract. I'm referring here to men that they can attract and keep. Big difference. No doubt each of these men, each of these women would have men who are ranked 8, 9, 10, 7, 6, 5, want to sleep with them. So all of these men want sex, would happily take sex from each of these women. So these women may be able to attract men who are 10s, 8s, 9s, 7, but none of these men would bestow the honor of choosing any of these women as their wives. The men they can attract and keep would have to be men who are comparable to where they are in terms of their sexual marketplace value. So on average, what they're going to get is an average man and a below average man. This is key because what we find in today's society is most women are stunned and are worried and are concerned as to why they cannot attract and keep good men. The reason is the choices you made came with consequences. Those consequences placed constraints on you, and unfortunately, because of such constraint, you would have to make a trade-off. Now, this is not to suggest that a woman who is in any of the categories apart from number one cannot find a good man. All of these men are good men. They're just average men. And by average, I'm not referring to their moral character. I'm not referring to their value system. I'm referring to their ability to provide and protect. I'm talking about economic value, which is what women focus on, resources, the man's ability to provide. Now, all of that, I say all of that to say this. The decision a woman makes between the age of 18 and 22, remember we talked about the categories, age categories for women, 23 to 27, 28 to 32, 33 to 35, and then 36 and above. This is where we get geriatric pregnancy, high risk pregnancy. Usually for men who are between the age of 23 all the way up to, say, 55, on average, if these men are of a certain socioeconomic status, and if these men want a family and want to have kids, they tend to prefer women in this age range. For example, if these men want to have 3 kids, at 27, the woman has 5 years to have all the kids, which takes her to age 32, which means she can then begin her life. Recovery, renewal. If she wants to get back into the job market, she can. They tend to avoid women specifically in this age group, but even more so women in this age group, because everything that they want, which is legacy, lineage, is at risk. Women in this age group, because it's only 3 years, they can only have 1 child that is not high risk. And for those who do not understand why this high risk issue matters, maybe you should spend some time, do some research, so you can understand the consequence of having a child and after high risk pregnancy, and what happens to the child and what could happen to the mother. The point I was trying to elaborate on is the sexual marketplace value of a woman reduces drastically as soon as she starts to have children. And the more children a woman has outside of wedlock, the less valuable she is in a man's eye. And the reason is simply because if a man has a certain amount of economic resources, he has to provide for himself and he has to provide for his lady. But if his lady comes with 2 other mouths to feed, these are not his. And so these children become liabilities and expenses. So she comes to what we call baggage. He has to now feed a family of 3. So he's getting not 1 person, but 3. Therefore, the resource requirement on him increases. But that's not the only issue. The main issue is that these 2 kids are not his children. They never will be, except he adopts them. But usually, they're not his children. So he has the legal responsibilities. He has the financial responsibilities for the kids that are not his, and he has no claim on the kids because they belong to another man. The other complication is that if he does have a child of his from the woman, then in the house, what you then have is this fraction that occurs. He has his children, and so suddenly you start to find this preferential relationship that begins, where his children are treated differently to the other kids. He can discipline his child, but he cannot discipline the other children. Therefore, what tends to happen is that the man starts to invest more of his time and his resources in one child over the other. That leads to resentment, animosity, even hatred. So most men do not want that, which is the reason why most men stay away from women who already have children, out of wedlock. If a woman has had a child inside wedlock, but her husband died, we treat it very differently. We treat it very sensitively. But if a woman has had a child, she's unmarried, but she has a child from multiple men, we see this woman as a woman who lacks discipline, who wasn't well raised, and who's made bad decisions. But the key thing to keep in mind is women make such mistakes, and the likelihood of such mistakes being made occurs the most between this age group, 18 to 22, which is the reason why men prefer the 23 to 27 age group. Because once you've gone between 18 and 22, that 5-year period, if you have survived and not made bad decisions, men tend to see that as a good positive sign. That either you have someone looking after you like a father, or generally you make good decisions. But the highest likelihood of you becoming a mother occurs in this period, because most women in this stage are usually quite young, quite naive, unwise, unguided, and unfortunately lacking discernment. So the point I'm making by this is if the mistake is made, it's not unusual to find that a woman who is 18 has a child, one child. And unfortunately, that becomes a liability. And she keeps trying to find a partner and doesn't find one even at 33 or 36. 18 years later on,